you know, it's low cost, that we can draw from a lot of people. We sure as hell can't go to Los Angeles or San Francisco or Boston or you know, any high price place.
Can't go to real expensive.
Yeah.
So St. Paul would be perfectly nice.
Can we at least go to Minneapolis?
I was going to say, I've been to several
We did talk. If we go back, it's going to be Minneapolis.
It's got to be Minneapolis.
Good morning, afternoon, whatever.
Our mic is on. We have to turn those on.
It sure is.
Just saying.
Oh, those are on?
Because I'm disparaging my hometown as I'm sitting here.
Are you done with the cues?
That's not bad. This? Oh, you want that back?
Yeah.
Oh, that's your cheat sheet. Yeah, that's right. Cool. I don't even need that.
I know, I was actually thinking it was good because you take notes.
This is very cool.
She's going to ask for impeachment inquiry. She finally announced 5 o'clock.
For you latecomers, I explained that I'm only going to take questions for the people with the tablecloth tables up here, so you need to move up front. My short little legs won't walk back that far. Okay?
I say give him a
We'd appreciate it if all of you silenced your cell phones. Hopefully you understand that we've got about 100+ years of experience up here that you're going to get advantage of. And Mitzi, you're not included in that, okay? That you get to ask questions of for free. The one presentation we got will be on the NATOA website. We're going to do a little presentation, and then we're going to do some Q&A. We've got some prepared questions, but we're hoping to get questions from you guys. If you've got something to write on, we would like you to submit your questions in legible writing. If it's not legible, I won't read it. But we're also going to take other questions too. It's just, you know, we got attorneys up there, so they want a chance to prepare. So, okay. The bios for all these folks are on the app. You know, if anybody's got any questions about who any of these people are, I'll direct you to them. Brian's going to start off, followed by Tim, and then Mitzi, and then I'll take over to ask some questions. So, can we get started? Okay.
All right.
I guess you got to do the button.
Yep, I will do that in just a second.
Oh, and you've got handouts in the back.
Do have some handouts in back that just describe at least one of the many different laws or regulations that we're going to be describing, so feel free to help yourself. Very much like, do not want to fly those home with me if possible. The panel, when we got together for this planning session to try to figure out how we were going to present this topic, we decided that what we would do is give 3 to 5 minutes on each of the key new FCC regulations and some of the federal laws governing cable television as well as wireless industry, both of which have dramatic impacts on your right-of-way. I'm going to cover 2 slides on the FCC 621 order. Tim, to my left, is going to cover 3 slides on everything you need to know about wireless. And Mitzi is going to then explain the impact of those new regulations on right-of-way control with a couple more slides. That's going to get us to about 15 minutes into this session, and then we're going to do more roundtable and have a little back and forth. We may not agree on everything that we're answering, but we thought it would be more entertaining to hear a little debate rather than to just have talking heads. So I'm going to kick it off here. Again, 2 slides for an 85-page order, and I'm going to do it in 3 minutes. So here we go. This is the 3rd order in the, what we like to call the 6. It's prospective only in application. The FCC made it clear that you don't take their new interpretation and look retroactively and go back 3 years, 5 years, 7 years under state statute of limitations and apply it looking backwards. You apply it from this Thursday looking forward. And that also will be probably subject to legal challenge. It already is subject to legal challenge from my colleague here to the left. So that is still very much in a gray area. Mixed use. This is the first significant finding that they had in the order. This is a unique one. This was pushed, you know, not surprisingly by the cable industry. We all know the cable industry offers voice, video, and data over a black wire that runs in the right-of-way. They don't just provide traditional cable TV. What this mixed use ruling says is the FCC has concluded that neither the state nor the local government can regulate non-cable services, facilities, or equipment. So if the operator would have put something up on its system, on the poles, deliver something other than traditional cable TV, according to the FCC, you're no longer permitted to regulate that via a separate franchise, license, a separate tax or fee. because the next part of this is you can't impose any fees on those non-cable services, facilities, and equipment. This was, as the FCC put it, a direct reaction to a case that, again, my colleague to the left, Tim Lay, handled on behalf of the city of Eugene, Oregon. It's prominently described in the FCC order, and it was an attempt to no longer permit local governments or states from trying to regulate these other services that a traditional cable operator would provide. Interestingly, the FCC also said, though, that Wi-Fi facilities, which, by the way, many operators place on their systems, even small cell antenna facilities are actually part of their cable system. So if you can reconcile those two, you're not permitted to regulate these things because they're considered non-cable services. They're not under the Cable Act. But these very clearly non-cable things are considered part of the cable system. That is what the order says. That's what we're grappling with, trying to figure out how that gets implemented and what that means. All right, again, rapid fire. I'm already over my 3 minutes. PEG capital. Costs incurred in acquiring and improving PEG facilities are PEG capital. You can do what you wish with those. Those do not count against the 5% franchise fee. Those do not include costs incurred in using the facilities. There was a lot of nice discussion in the FCC order about their view of what is operation and what is capital and what cities can and can't spend their PEG fees on. It's and frankly, it was probably one of the more welcome provisions out of the 621 order, in that it did not go and close doors on what would be considered a capital or an operational expense. But again, in 3 minutes, no time to go into too much detail. One of the things you've been hearing about a lot is the phrase in kind. It's a phrase the FCC uses to describe non-monetary obligations. So think of your cable franchise. You got this contract with a company. In that contract, they agreed to a number of different things. If you require them to pay a 5% franchise fee on their gross revenues for cable TV service, then you cannot also, according to the FCC, require them to provide these non-monetary or in-kind obligations. So what are those? Free service to schools and public buildings. Those are most clearly defined by the FCC as an in-kind obligation. If that is $85 a month per drop for equipment and facility, or equipment and service, times 100 locations in town, there you have the value that the operator could essentially assess or even offset against your 5% franchise fee cap. Institutional networks are also considered an in-kind obligation. They go very far in describing free or discounted institutional network services. So if those are burned into your franchise, that probably deserves a whole separate discussion about an INET. Each of those are very unique, but most definitely the FCC described those as an in-kind obligation. Transport. How does the PEG signal get from City Hall or any other origination location back to the head end? The FCC said that you can't charge back the capital cost of that, but you can charge for the maintenance, and they use the phrase "and operation" of those transport facilities. Stay tuned for how the industry may interpret that provision. I don't believe that that was intended to be calculated at fair market value from my read, but it appears that others may disagree with that interpretation. It excludes customer service and build out. Those things the operator is not permitted to offset. PEG channel capacity, they essentially delayed their decision on this, deciding that they had an incomplete record. They promised that they would issue that decision within 12 months. Another sidelight of this order is the LFAs, so that's local franchising authorities, are only able to require, quote, adequate PEG access, channel capacity, facilities, or financial support. And the FCC defined adequate to mean satisfactory or sufficient. That's been in the Cable Act for 35 years. To the best of my knowledge, I've been working in this industry for 30 years, heaven forbid, but I have never heard any discussion sitting around a table on renewal talking about adequacy. I've heard about future cable-related needs and interests, Haven't heard about this one. This is a new issue. Again, jury's out on how the industry may react to this language and what they may see as adequacy, what you may have to prove up for adequacy. Franchise modification process. The FCC in their draft order had said that you had to go actually and get a modification of the franchise before you could implement this order. Now the FCC has said in their final order they encourage parties to negotiate franchise modifications. So that means the operator has an option here. They could go and talk to you, and if they do, they're expected to give a reasonable period of time to get the modification done. Probably 120 days is what the FCC suggests, but nothing compels them to do that. And I certainly have heard at least one significant cable operator, major MSO in the country, has said they see no legal obligation to have to go to thousands of LFAs and negotiate modifications. They could certainly take the position that they are simply going to offset from your 5% franchise fee cap. Now, I don't know that they'll do that, but they certainly believe they have the option to do that. And again, since this doesn't become effective till Thursday, we won't know what the reaction is until this conference is closed out. There's my 2 slides.
Thanks, Brian. I have 3 slides, but I will not try to do 50% longer for that. Although my discussion is a little bit in even more of a tangled mess than the Section 621 proceeding. It deals with the FCC started a proceeding, I think it was 2 years ago, in 2017, a docket about wireline and wireless infrastructure, promoting wireline infrastructure deployment. It could have been named, what can we do to restrict the authority of local governments to make wireless and wireline providers happier and lower their costs, because that's what it's really all about. But in fairness, there have been a series of orders. For instance, most of the focus on the wireless side has been about what are called small cell facilities. They're called that. The FCC defined small cell facilities, but it didn't do that until the spring of 2018, I believe. In that proceeding, which was not one of the 2 orders you see listed up there, it was an earlier order. It defined small cell facilities in the context of deciding that small cell facilities would be exempt from the FCC's required review under the National Historic Preservation Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. That small cells are small, after all, so they really shouldn't have any impact on historic preservation or the environment. And most of the FCC chair and a couple of the other commissioners kept saying, we don't understand why local governments and historic environmental people are concerned about small cells. They're all the size of a pizza box. What's the problem? Except the very same commissioners who said that they're so small they shouldn't be a problem defined them to include towers up to 50 feet tall, or the greater of that, or the height of a structure, nearby structure. So to use as an example, I don't know how many feet tall this hotel is, but under the FCC's reasoning, if a small cell provider wanted to erect a pole in the city of Tampa's right-of-way near this building, it could be small. It would still qualify for the benefits of the FCC's small cell rules that I'll talk about in a minute, even if it were as tall as this building. That's small. Now, that decision was appealed by, largely by Indian tribes, Native American tribes, successfully, for the most part. I get too sidelined into that, but the important thing about that is what the Court of Appeals in remanding that NEPA, National Historic Preservation Act aspect of the small cell order recognized is the FCC's small cells were, first of all, not small, but secondly, their anticipated footprint. The industry itself says, we anticipate there'll be 500,000 or more of these we anticipate installed before the middle part of the next decade. So you'll have across the country, mostly concentrated in major urban and suburban markets, 500,000 of these things being installed all over the place. And the court said, that's a massive impact. You can't say that's not going to have any historic preservation impact or environmental impact. Go back and try again, FCC. But nevertheless, it didn't overturn what the definition of a small cell is. So the definition I just gave you of a small cell is what applies to the two rulings we're going to talk about here. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on the first one. That's not to say it's not important, but last August, the FCC issued a declaratory ruling to do, and basically ruled that moratorium, which are basically anything that, you know, stops or delays not just the granting of permits for small cell facilities, but the acceptance or processing of any applications for them, are prohibited by one or both of two provisions of the 96 Act. There's the wireless siting provision, which is section 332C7, and there's the general barrier to entry provision, which is section 253. Ostensibly, the FCC was a little vague about this, said that a moratorium would also apply to generally applicable laws that didn't just single out small cell or even wireless applications. They could apply to any sort of work in the right-of-way if you had a moratorium, if you had a frost and freeze law, if you had a road shut down during hurricane season. Well, they're generally applicable, and small cell facilities might not be installed as a result of that. That order is being appealed. The bigger order in the sense of the number of different things it did was 1 month later, the FCC issued an order which called the small cell order, is what we call it. It basically placed a lot of restrictions on local authority over the placement of small cell facilities. Sort of we'll break down some of the aspects here. The first one you'll see is fees. The FCC said that any fee in excess of a locality's costs incurred as a result of a small cell application constitutes a prohibition on the provision of service. In other words, it's preempted. Now, the Act says prohibitions are not preempted if they're fair and reasonable compensation, but the FCC took care of that problem by saying, well, anything above cost is a prohibition, and by the way, anything above cost is also not fair and reasonable compensation, so presto, anything above cost is prohibited by federal law. And here you have a sort of, oops, went the wrong way, a sort of summary of the various fees, the caps the FCC set. What it did is it said you can only, a local government is only entitled to costs, but we'll set some safe harbor presumptions. To use as an example, a recurring fee of $270 a year, but that's for the sum total, whether the provider is erecting a new pole in your right-of-way, whether it's attaching to an existing pole that's owned by a privately owned utility or owned to your pole, or whatever, the sum of all of that, including if you have a municipal utility, what your municipal utility charges for pole attachment fees, the entire sum of that can't exceed $270 a year. If you charge $270 or less, that'll be presumptively cost-based, unless the operator challenges it, but then the operator would have to prove your cost or less. But if you go $1 over $270, then you are presumptively charging in excess of cost, and the burden is on the local government to prove that its costs are greater than $270. Then you have the one-time application fees. The problem with them is not so much the fact that they're cost-based, because under most state laws, application fees are cost-based anyway, but the sort of presumptive caps they put on them, particularly when you're considering there are going to be thousands, and in a decent-sized community, you could get scores, if not hundreds, of these applications they have to process, and you'll have to process them within a shot clock time period. You'll see they also imposed so-called aesthetic requirements, limitations on local land use aesthetics requirements, and you'll see the list of what they have to be. Now, of course, what is an objective aesthetic requirement? What is a reasonable one? What is non-discriminatory published in advance? Those are things that are going to have to be worked out. Published in advance generally means, what the FCC contemplates, is that an FCC will adopt an ordinance or a written policy that will set forth this is what we, if you want to install a small cell, this is what it should be look like if you have appearance limitations. The problem is that there's no flexibility in what the FCC proposes. In other words, part of the problem is that location matters. Where specifically the facility is going to be, what the proposed facility looks like, what type of pole it's going to be look on, what is surrounding it, what's in the neighborhood, what's on the sidewalk that it's going to be installed on. The FCC doesn't really allow much for that kind of flexibility. The FCC also imposed presumptive shot clocks for any small cell application. A shorter one for co-location on existing poles, a slightly longer one, 90 days, if they're building a new pole in your right-of-way. One of the things that's most disturbing about the order is the next bullet. The FCC's previous rulings for the original shot clocks on wireless siting applications that many of you might remember that was over a decade ago all had to do with land use applications. In other words, when a city is exercising its land use authority over placement of wireless facilities on private property. In other words, and it was putting shot clocks on how fast your land use authority should act. The deadlines here apply not just to land use authority small cell applications, but more importantly, because in fact industry, particularly given the cost-based fees that the FCC is imposing, is going to be more interested in locating facilities on your right-of-way as opposed to private property. But those deadlines apply to placement, requests to place facilities on the city's streets and rights-of-way, and on access to city-owned infrastructure in that right-of-way, be it a utility pole if you have municipal utility, or a light pole if you own the street lights, or a traffic light pole if you own traffic lights. So what this purports to do is basically set a shot clock and give a provider access to your infrastructure, not just to restrict your land use authority over the placement of these, but to restrict your ability to say no to private profit-making attachments to your facilities and in the rights-of-way. And that's my last point, too. For cities that have municipal utilities, it's a concern because the FCC basically treats municipal utilities and its city the same, and so when you're summing up whatever the shot clock deadlines are and whatever the fee reimbursement and also costs or rental costs for use of rights-of-way, those presumptive fee limits apply to the sum total of all of those. And that decision, as you might imagine, is being appealed to the Ninth Circuit by, I think if you count all the local government petitioners and interveners, we're talking about, I think, 80 or more, 80 or 90 more. Briefing has been completed. It was completed last month. And a request for expedited oral argument will be made. We certainly hope for a decision next year, hopefully the first part of next year, but there's no guarantee of that. And in the meantime, localities sort of have to sort of wrestle with what to do because the order is still in effect, it's not stayed. And so localities are facing the issue in small cell applications, and it is sort of a threshold decision you have to make is, are you going to fight to preserve your rights in the event the appeal is successful? But with that, I've probably overstayed my welcome, and I'll hand it over to Mitzi.
Thank you. Thank you. So Tim mentioned that the FCC orders could have been titled how to give more money to industry at the expense of local government. I'd say that the subtitle is, I wanted to be a Supreme Court justice or a senator, but all I got was to be an FCC commissioner, so I thought I'd play one on paper. In this chart, I mean, I say this, but, you know, in all honesty, the administration that brought you, putting children in cages, getting out of the Paris Climate Agreement, making car fuel efficient standards worse, said, hey, let's look at broadband. Let's look at cable. Let's look at it. So in some ways, what they're doing, it's not that surprising, but at the same time, it's relatively shocking to actually see it there. So what you're looking at is, one thing I want to point out is those red and italics, those are all things that are being litigated. So trying to say what it's important, I think, for all people to understand is there's what the FCC is claiming should be the case, and there is almost all of that is subject to litigation. Things are still will take effect or have taken effect, but some of them are not. You got to have the cable operators come in and ask formally for changes to their franchise. So one thing I would ask here is, how many people are you are either part of a consortium, or you are a city or a county that is, you would say, is sort of the top 3, top 5 market in your state? All right. And then how many people are not in that top 5? You're in a smaller community, right? Make friends, because what you will likely see is you will see people come after the smaller groups first, who have fewer resources, and come to say, well, this is what the law says. And it's important that you talk with other folks in your state or in your region so that you try to all stand together, because a large part of this is going to come down to negotiation and what people are saying the law means while we're still in litigation. And the litigation that Tim talked about being briefed is at the Ninth Circuit right now. The in-kind order won't go, it takes effect of what, it's the 26th, so.
Thursday.
Today, is that today? Thursday. And there'll be more litigation about that. So be careful also when you're looking at, well, what can we do, what can we can't do. Don't give away things in writing saying, well, this is what I think the law means, and now I've conceded of arguing it, but this is what the cable operator is going to argue, this is what telco might argue, so that's one thing to think about. The big thing I think that you want to look at is what the FCC is really trying to do is to say, we would really like for industry to get in and being able to use everything you own for free with no regulations. But I guess we have to say that you at least can get cost, and there's this really annoying thing called the Cable Act, which said you could get 5%. So how can I whittle away at that by saying, here's a slew of things that you could subtract from that? And then we'll go further to say, if you're a cable operator, local governments, you can't put any other obligations on that entity. That entity should be able to provide more than cable service, and all you should be able to collect is on the cable service. And if it's a telecom provider, I'm going to say that the only thing you can collect is cost. And if it's a broadband service provider who is providing neither cable nor telephone, you point to something in the congressional statute that says that you have authority to do anything, because everything else, I think, as the FCC have tried to eviscerate. And if you kind of understand, that's what the end game is. So this chart is showing you is on the cable where you would have had the 5%, what they want to do is they want to reduce that 5% by allowing the cable operator to deduct. I would not concede on that fair market value. It still says that there is a negotiation, and I'm in a place too where I would say that that cable's been installed. It's been there for 20 years. It is a fully depreciated asset. We agreed that we would pay maintenance costs. You can come and argue what the value of that is, but I already paid for it in some cases. So again, don't concede your bargaining position. And I'm going to just cover quickly on the right-of-way and then cover the taxes and try to do this quickly. And Tim nicely did a slide, which I think I get to talk about because we gave Tim enough time. So on the telecom, the thing there is what the FCC has, the statute says you can't materially inhibit the provision of service. You can't have the effect of doing it. And what the FCC has said is, well, if you charge more than cost, that would have the effect of prohibiting their service, so therefore you can only limit it to cost. That's being challenged in court. On the broadband in the right-of-way, what their big thing is, because in most communities, the biggest entity that provides service is also the cable operator, or is the telephone company that's providing cable service. So what they're saying is, by virtue, if you've got a cable franchise, you cannot charge additional fees for the non-cable service. That's what they're trying to argue, and that will be litigated. On the taxes, what they have tried to do is to say is that, well, the cable statute says 5% means 5%, and that would include these other taxes. The general way the law works is that if you have a tax statute that applies to something not because of your status as a cable operator, so everybody doing in business pays a sales tax, cable service is subject to it the same way your dry cleaning is. Those generally have not been changed yet. If on telecom, states have typically had taxes on telecom, and where the telecom tax is not related to right-of-way use. So you may charge a per line fee or a service fee, or there might be a surcharge that's imposed for education, separate from 911 fees. those generally have not been touched. In broadband, there is the Internet Tax Freedom Act, which generally says you cannot tax the internet service. However, if you were trying to reach things like Netflix and Hulu and services that were sold for those things, potentially you could reach those if it applied not just because it's offered over a cable system, if it was offered over anything. Virginia's got one, communications tax. It also taxes satellite. You'll have lots of fighting about, if I have this tax and I'm already paying a franchise fee, should I not have to pay it, and it'll move forward in that area. But this is kind of the framework, and I would just use this to say that there's at least 3 pieces of litigation out there, plus there's the Verizon order, and the ones that are coming out. So if you're not part of a legal coalition, you need to be part of one. You need to be looking and thinking about what is all the money that is coming in that I have at risk on the table, because now is the time. All of these cases are going to decide whether or not local governments can actually, the taxpayer-funded assets that all these cable operators and telecom and everybody else wants to come in and serve your city because you have a dense area and it's cost-effective. The question of whether you can have any say in that is up right now. So it's important, if you're not part of a coalition, to be part of one. On the taxes, I think we covered most of this, but just to kind of sum these up is, if you have taxes and they're not related to the right-of-way, they're generally not impacted. You have to kind of assess within your own local community whether you almost always have to go back to the state legislature to address your authority to do certain things. So one thing that you can be doing is doing an analysis now of where is the money coming from, what are the impact, if we use a different model, what's the impact? And that's going to be part of your discussions. Most people's legislatures are going to start back up in the new year. Some people are year-round, but those are the kinds of things that now is the time to be working on those. As Tim noted, the PEG fees probably will be harder to retrain, and it's going to just come down to what's in the litigation. And the Internet Tax Freedom Act continues to sit out there as a general prohibition. But the other last thing I would say is that in some states, where you have put together a tax and a certain portion of that tax may be going to help underserved areas, rural areas, low income, those programs can be easier to defend, and they may be able to get a push through, because what you'll know is that an industry will tell you in rural areas, they are never going to have enough money to do it all by themselves. They're going to have to be some subsidy from somebody, whether it's the federal government or the state government. So creating those funds that can benefit local governments as well as state can be a benefit. So with that, I think Garth's got questions.
Well, hopefully we got some from you guys too, okay? Wow. Nice to turn around and see a whole full room. If you've got questions, pass them over. In the meantime, you know, you've talked about costs. How do you define costs?
Well, it's interesting. The FCC said it was not going to set forth a specific definition of cost. It was going to leave that ostensibly, it suggested, to court litigation. Although this FCC, if it doesn't like what courts does, I'm sure, unless the FCC changes after 2021, if it doesn't like what courts say, it will probably come back and say what it thinks cost means. Industry, in their comments, have argued that cost only means the incremental cost a city incurs from having to process an application, and if you can identify any incremental costs associated with putting another fixture in the right-of-way, but they do not think that it should include fully distributed costs. In other words, even though they're making money off your right-of-way, they don't think they should have to pay their fair share of the full cost that the city pays to acquire and maintain the right-of-way. But in fairness, the FCC's order does not answer that question.
But when they sell a service to you, they sell it at an incremental cost, correct?
Well, no, that's what I was saying. If is charging over costs prohibits things, I mean, I think all sorts of things I pay for all the time are above cost that should mean I'm prohibited from being able to buy them.
I'm sorry, Betsy.
Well, one thing, and I will say that Montgomery County right now is working with Garth's firm, also CTC, BBK, but Ashpaugh and Sculco, to actually examine what our true right-of-way costs are. And to really kind of understand that, there's all the money that you're paying out for various things, or can be building, there's maintenance, in some places you've got snow plowing, you've got traffic lighting, but you also have, when people come in and they ask for a right-of-way franchise, and it goes to me and it goes to somebody else, and I spend time on it, and there's a computer that I work on, and there's light and there's heat, thankfully, and air conditioning in the building that I work in, all that can also be part of that. So I encourage you to either have a right-of-way study done, work potentially, if you're in a smaller community, is there somebody else out there who's potentially doing one, a larger community who could do it, that you could say, well, our costs are somewhat similar, or they're a percentage of that, or sort of to do that, because this is all data that you can arm yourself with when somebody comes in and says, is it limited to cost? Well, here's my study that says what it is, and then we can have an argument about how much of that you should have to pay. But if I've at least got something that I can defend, I feel like I'm in a better position than just having to take a guess.
Yeah, one thing I would add to what Mitzi said about cost is it's already happened. Had providers say, if you propose any fee above $270, recurring fee, they'll say, well, where's your cost study? They're expecting a cost study. But I also say to my industry friends, be careful what you wish for, because what they're really hoping for is they like nationwide uniformity. They'd prefer that, okay, if you were 270 or below fixed throughout the country, that's the world I want. Be careful what you wish for, because costs by city and community, whether it's talking about the labor cost, real estate cost, everything else vary tremendously. If what industry wants is predictability, cost is not going to provide that to them. It will vary in every single community in the country, and they also will find that some cost a whole lot more than $270. So I just say to them, they better be careful what they wish for.
Just to state the obvious,
New York is more expensive than Edina, Minnesota, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
just to state the obvious, though, everybody make sure you're in the wireless bucket right now when you're talking about costs. You're not in the cable 621 bucket. That's a whole different discussion when we talked about maintenance costs, fair market value. What they're talking about right now is costs as it relates to the placement of wireless facilities in your right-of-way.
Yeah, but I just would add, I think that, one, the FCC is trying to do that convergence. You still have the Cable Act that says 5%, but in a real right-of-way study cost, you're going to want to know how much does the gas company, the water company, the electric utility, all those things that you typically may not want to tax or charge because they have obligations to provide service everywhere, but understanding what all of those are and what the cable and the telecom actually cost in comparison, I think will be of benefit down the road, even though the statute doesn't say right now that that's what it's subject to. I think you're preparing yourself to be in a better spot as well, because if you're sitting there, you're talking about the franchise fees and what's the value of the fair market value of the service that you're providing, and I know what the cost is for you to actually be in the right-of-way, I think that informs the conversation.
Okay. Brian, before we get started on those, I want to ask you, that national company you're referring to that's headquartered in Philadelphia?
No, it's not. It is not headquartered in Philadelphia. Different company. But
well, I'll ask you about the one in Philadelphia.
Okay.
I would assume that the Philadelphia company is not going to go to every single individual LFA in the country and determine what in-kind costs are. They're going to make a decision out of Philadelphia and apply that to everybody in the country. Okay? Would you agree with that?
You know, it's interesting, and I can't speak for Comcast clearly. I suspect many of these operators are still trying to figure out how best to implement it. And as Mitzi mentioned, they're all well aware of the fact that this is already in litigation. And we're not going to have any answer on the litigation for at least 18 to 24 months. So put yourself in the shoes of being a major operator with 5,000 franchises. Do you want to spend the human capacity to go to every single one, try to go through a modification process, knowing that some of them are going to be very sophisticated, like Mitzi described, and say, why would I agree to burn in the FCC's findings that I don't agree with when I'm not even sure if the court's going to uphold them? So there's the cloud hanging over, how is the industry going to implement it? There's also the issue that says nothing in this FCC orders requires non-discriminatory application, right? Generally, cities can't discriminate or shouldn't be discriminated against equally situated providers, but nothing says that if We have Tampa here and St. Petersburg there. I know you're a state franchising, but let's just play my scenario for a moment. I decide, you know, I'm not so crazy about Tampa. They have been a very big thorn in my side from a regulatory standpoint. I am going to impose these various in-kind offsets against them. St. Petersburg, they're kind of a partner. They buy a bunch of services from us. Nothing says you have to treat them the same, at least as I read under that FCC order. So I'm not suggesting that the industry would do it in a disparate manner, but I don't see anything that prohibits them from doing it that way.
Yeah, but doesn't the FCC say that I have to follow these rules? I don't have a choice?
Well, yeah, most of the time I spend is sitting in rooms with cable operators around the country negotiating franchises. And I've heard at least 3 or 4 very different stories. One large operator said, we have no plans to do anything for the foreseeable future. We're going to let this all play out. We're not going to approach anybody on anything. Not in existing franchises. We're going to handle renewals the same way we always have. Doesn't mean they won't ultimately change their mind and try to trigger something. I've heard others say, be ready on the 27th of September. We expect to immediately be implementing this and calculating on a franchise-by-franchise basis every non-monetary obligation. And you know, I've certainly heard different things from the Comcast folks too, but I'm not so sure that every operator views that statement by the FCC to say, if they don't do it, you know, within 120 days of the effective date, that they're in violation of the law, and that the FCC are going to send out traffic cops to cite them. I don't sense that.
No,
I don't sense the industry believes that they're in that much harm if they don't comply.
The reason the FCC said that, yeah, because they're not going to go out and police the cable operators and see how come you're not taking advantage of our order. But the reason they said it is that enables a cable operator, and the vast majority of cable operators are in the middle of a franchise right now. They're not right in renewal at this moment. They basically have ruled that any cable operator, if it wishes, they're basically giving the cable operator the unilateral authority to say, okay, I'm implementing it. I don't care if it's inconsistent with what my franchise agreement says. I can switch midstream and I can start deducting. What it's doing is giving the operator license to do that, basically wiping away any claim that the city can make that, wait a minute, you signed this agreement, for the rest of the agreement you agreed to this, you can't do that. The FCC saying, oh yes they can. But it's not going to, if a cable operator for whatever reason decides not to do that for now, no, the FCC is not going to come after them.
But Mitzi said something a moment ago, it was really, got to hammer this home. Be careful not to sign off on a document that stipulates that their interpretation of this is the right one. That's a heads they win, tails they win scenario. So then it doesn't matter if the litigation ultimately proves successful and the whole thing gets kicked back. You've already modified your franchise in writing. It's over. There's nothing more to talk about. You have agreed to a new contract.
Yeah, to keep the math simple, I mean, the Cable Act says you can charge up to 5% in the franchise fee. If the cable operator persuades you, well, unless this FCC order, I guess we're only going to be paying you 3%, and the other 2% is going to be in kind, and if you sign that modification, guess what? Even if it's overturned, you've agreed to a 3% franchise fee, so that's what you've got.
Yeah,
I just would add in there that I would be very careful of having any operator who comes in and says, well, sorry, I'd like to do something better for you, but the FCC says I can't. I have a hard time believing that if a cable company wanted to come in and say, hey, we're going to donate some computers to this school because we want to be good corporate citizens, that, oh, I'm sorry, I can't donate computers anymore because the FCC said I'm a cable operator and all I can give you and the value that you'd have to deduct. I just don't see it as reaching that far. So again, don't give up on any rights that you don't have to. And when the cable operator comes in and says, oh, I have no choice, you always have a choice. They always have a choice. And whether that means also that you want to be getting involved, your elected officials, your statewide officials, of saying, you guys have been good partners. You've been out there. Are you saying now, truly, that you want to make more money on the backs of school children? Is that what your position is? And put it to them that way.
Okay, now, I wanted to remind everybody at 3:30 tomorrow, I believe, we have a closed session on the 621 order, okay? What time, Nancy? 4 o'clock, excuse me. And then on Thursday, we have roundtables on franchising where you can have small groups talk about a lot of these issues also. Yeah. Yeah.
If you're coming to the meeting tomorrow at 4 o'clock, so tomorrow. Thursday, right? Tomorrow, right? Tomorrow. Okay. Wednesday. I said, okay. So if you're coming to the meeting tomorrow and you've already heard from your cable operator, if they've already given you an indication what they're going to do with the order, could you bring that information to us? We're trying to figure out the different opportunities. And when I say we, I mean under leadership of Nancy. We're trying to figure out with Tim and with Brian and Ken Feldman and all the other local government lawyers, we're trying to figure out what our next step could be. And if we had more information about what the cable operators are saying to different folks around the country, especially if it's in writing, that would really be helpful.
Okay. Yeah.
Can I just be clear that this is not on the agenda, so for those who are looking at the agenda going, this isn't there, it's not. It was a last-minute ad for some reasons Jerry stated. We've got a bunch of people here, let's talk about what they're hearing. So it's not on the agenda, it is just for local governments, so it's one of the very few closed sessions that we have. So 4 o'clock tomorrow.
And what room do you know?
I believe it's this room.
Do it right here. Okay.
I'll give you an announcement tomorrow when I
All right. Okay. I'm not a techie person. So. Okay, yeah. You guys want to start on those questions up there, Brian?
I'll read this aloud, and I'll let one of these folks take first cut at it. Well, here, I'll try this one. Why isn't the mixed-use rule considered to be creating an unfair advantage for cable companies over ILECs and CLECs?
Well, considering I filed a petition for review for the City of Eugene of the order, that is precisely the argument we made to the FCC, and we will make on appeal. In the case of Eugene, they have a 7% right-of-way fee for telecom use, and telecom under their ordinance is defined broadly enough to include broadband. By the way, we had to go all the way to the Oregon Supreme Court to litigate that issue with Comcast. That's precisely the problem. What the FCC has done is said that in any case where you have a gross revenue-based right-of-way fee on non-cable service for all telecom users in your community, they've basically given the cable operator a free ride for its non-cable services on the right-of-way, whereas all of its competitors who don't offer cable service do have to pay a right-of-way fee. Now, the cable operator will say, no, 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 I'm already paying 5%. Well, yeah, from your cable services, and your cable subscribers pay you for that. What they're also overlooking is, if you're looking at all of this as compensation for the right-of-way, as many of you may know, the trend line in the cable industry is their broadband revenue is surpassing their cable revenue. When you sum those two, a percentage of that is how much the right-of-way is really worth to the cable operator. So the right-of-way's value to the cable operator in terms of how much revenue it can generate off the right-of-way is going up. But if you restrict the fee to cable services, guess what happens to what the city gets for it? It keeps going down while the value of the right-of-way keeps going up for the cable operator. But short answer to the question is, we are making that very argument on appeal.
Let me supplement that with one thing. 60, 80 years ago, when they were starting to build these systems in your rights-of-way, they came to you and they said, hey, look, it costs me a lot of money to put this system in your rights-of-way. If I have to start paying you fees for the use of your rights-of-way, because when I place my assets, then I can't afford to build it. So how can I put stuff in your rights-of-way without paying you any fees until I actually earn revenue? How do we do that? We pay 5% of revenues based upon when they actually get revenues for the occupation of rights-of-way, okay? Now, if you've been charging them all along for the rent of the rights-of-way on a different format, you know, then some of them may never have been there to begin with. So, okay?
Well, we actually have that happening right now in the state of Maryland, where the state, for separate reasons, was looking at auditing what it was charging and wanting to have a consistent policy. And they've come across a per foot as well as a per fiber charge, and what it has is the perverse effect of making it more expensive at the time of construction to put in spare capacity, which is not something that you really want to be discouraging if you're trying to attract a lot of tech companies. So even though it's much harder legally to defend the gross revenues, there is case in point, particularly when you're doing fiber construction, you actually want to encourage more capacity built at that time. It's lower cost, and for scarcity reasons, if you put it in at the same time, you can put it right next to each other. If you come back later, you've got to separate it out. So there's also an argument that these policies are not pro-business, they are not pro-innovation.
I'm going to ask another question here, and I'm going to start by saying this is a cable question. So this is a 621 order, in case anybody's getting mixed up between wireless, and we're crossing over a lot of different things here. And I'll take a first shot at this one. Is the FCC likely trying to establish operating cost for PEG transport to be a model for PEG channels? So I think what this question is getting at is they did not give us an answer as to whether or not they're going to allow the cost of PEG channels to be offset from the franchise fee. They gave us a pretty strong indication. They said, we think it is a non-monetary in-kind obligation, but we don't have enough of a record yet to decide that. I think, though, the second piece of this is not everybody is going to value transport the same way. The FCC order says that an operator is entitled to recoup maintenance and operation costs related to transport, not the construction costs, not the fair market value. Some operators are going to view that and say, well, I'm just going to charge a transport fee, $500 a month, $200 a month. They're going to pick a number out based on what they think the marketplace would charge. Sounds like fair market value. Others are going to look at it and say, I've already built that, I've depreciated the cable, there ain't no maintenance costs left to recoup. It doesn't cost me anything to have the city hall connected into the hub, so I'm not charging you a nickel. And those could be two cities right next to each other paying very different fees. That's just the way the order is worded, and I don't know exactly how we're going to get clarification on that.
Well, I would just physically add on that to be thinking about, in most of these cases, and this actually happened a lot in Fairfax County, negotiated in a relatively small part of the county in Virginia, something with Comcast, and they argued a lot about the maintenance costs at the time of it. But as it turns out over the years, as it played out, it was really very insignificant. If you have, the most common thing that happens to cable is a squirrel and heat chews on it. It's true. I don't know why, but it is. Anyway, but the issue is the cable operator is going to go out there and do that truck roll and have to be out there and repair that. And in most cases, you'll actually just like cut it off at the ends and you'll do it. So there might be like some minor splicing costs, but the bulk of that cost they were already going to have to expend. So this would be a case where I would argue that I'd only have to pay the insignificant incremental cost on that. There could also be things where you might want to say and argue that, well, if I'm going to have to pay for these things or pay for this, then I want greater ownership rights, or I want an IRU, or I want other things that customers, I want service, I want HD, I want other things that as a, and if you look and you look at the cost of that, we have, Montgomery County has got more free drops than any place I've ever seen. But for a lot of these, they're already built. They provide that signal. They're not, all of these accounts are already exempt from the fees that they would end up having to pay programmers. So if you cut them off, you don't actually save any money. So what's the fair market value of something that doesn't cost you anything for which it's already built out? So I think that, again, don't concede anything. And to a large extent, a lot of these cable operators, it's going to come up for us in the DC area. A lot of us have renewals. That's probably going to be where the fight happens. But it's worth talking to the operator to see, how does this play out? Let's have some business certainty. Let's be good partners and see how these things play out. So I would also, try to work with the entities in there too, because their kids go to school in your town too.
The only thing I would add to the question is I agree with everything both Brian and Mitzi said about mitigating. If the question was, do you think the FCC's decision was, sort of presaging what they're going to do about PEG channel capacity, I think it's a very strong indication. Commissioner O'Reilly has made that perfectly clear, and that's one reason why they want to move very quickly. It's one reason why Mike Wassenaar deserved the award he got at lunch today. One reason I think the commission would have ruled that PEG capacity is a franchise fee, except for the fact that there was a lot of pushback from Congress, 40 or 50 letters or more from members of Congress, objecting to that aspect of the commission's proposal. And so my own cynical view is this commission decided it knows what it's going to do with PEG channel capacity, but it decided to hold back from it in this order to take a little flack off and hope that the rest of Congress will be too preoccupied with impeachment or something else 6 months from now, and so they'll be able to sneak it through then. I mean, that's my own view about what they'll probably do in 6 months.
So what should you do about that, Tim?
What we should do about that is, one, by the way, that's why this first appeal that's already been filed is important, because one thing the FCC did do in that order was reject an argument that we and other local governments made, and that is you don't even have to get to whether PEG channel capacity is a capital cost or not, because any requirement that has in a separate provision of the Act, like PEG channel capacity and institutional networks, which specifically authorizes local franchising authorities to impose, is by itself cannot be a franchise fee. In other words, there's a separate provision of the Act that permits franchising authorities to require to set aside capacity for PEG access and for institutional networks, so therefore they can't be franchise fees. The FCC rejected that argument. If we win that argument on appeal, then we don't have to worry about whether, PEG channel capacity is a capital cost.
Well, let me take the softball that Jerry's throwing out there, and what the FCC said is, we encourage comments on this issue. So they punted for 12 months. 12 months would end up being roughly August of next year, right? Just prior to the next election cycle. So they will get this decision done before that occurs. It's not even clear whether they're going to open a separate rulemaking proceeding. It's not even clear if there'll be a deadline for this. But you can bet that the industry is very concerned about this, as they should be. This is their business. They're going to put in robust comments. They may put in economic studies. They may have university professors opine on these things. We have a few other things on our plate as cities. We have multiple appeals, all kinds of challenges, other things on the wireless side going on. Someone, somewhere has got to step up and put in some quality comments related to this issue on PEG channel capacity, or the FCC is only going to hear one side of the story. And I know you're getting fatigue on that request because you hear it a lot, and you have been hearing it a lot, but this is kind of game time. If you lose on the channel capacity and you end up having to pay fair market value for channel capacity, then there won't be a production side, there won't be a production track at NATOA, because there won't be anything to produce for. There won't be any channels left. I mean, I hate to be real doom and gloom, but that's a reality.
And the thing I'd add, the good point that Brian made, do not necessarily think these comments to be filed in the FCC defending PEG channel capacity need to be made. But they do not need to be made because they will persuade this FCC to go our way. They probably won't. The reason they need to be filed is because when the FCC makes an adverse decision, you have to have your arguments and facts in the record if you want to have a chance of beating them on appeal. So that's the reason they have to be put in.
The other piece I would just add, how many people in here are in a state where you have a Republican U.S. Senator or a U.S. Representative? Okay, hold your hands up. How many of you have met with those people? Raise your other hand if you've met. Raise both hands if you've met with. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, 5. I'm sorry to say, but it is the way the world is in D.C. Almost all the letters and things that have come, they have come from the Democratic side, and they're good, and they need to keep coming. But what we need is ways to help people who have a Republican senator, particularly if you're from a state where you have state franchising, where you've seen what has happened to PEG, taking those comments and putting a one-pager so that the staff person at the congressional level knows what it is and you can talk about it. I work right outside of DC. If you're coming and you want some help, there's people in here will help, I will help you. But we need to, when it comes down to saying, well, this is what the law, I mean, you literally have Commissioner O'Reilly saying, well, Congress should feel free to follow my lead, right? I mean, this is a totally topsy-turvy world. The more that you can get these folks engaged and to understand, particularly if they used to be a council member and they really value the importance of having your channels on the television station so people can see what is happening in transparent and open government. Those are the kinds of things, the things of what they've come to your studio and they've done shows. If they go out to those things, it's all the same things we've been saying, but now more than ever, it's important to tie those things together.
I have one other question that.
No, I got Jerry's got a comment.
Okay, right.
No,
And I've got one.
I have a slightly alternative view as to why the commission didn't reach the issue of whether or not channel capacity was an in-kind contribution subject to offset. I think they had 67 reasons not to reach that issue. That's the number of Congress folks that reached out to them. I'll make a deal with everyone in the room here. You don't have to file comments at the FCC telling them not to address that issue if you get your member of Congress to do that. We've got lots of models that you can use. Mitzi's exactly correct. You score double points if your member happens to be a member of the president's party. And so...
and you get a triple Scrabble score if they're on the Commerce Committee.
Well,
Actually, I'd say
if you get a triple for that, you get a quadruple score if they're on the Appropriations Committee that funds the FCC.
Well, I think it goes up. I think if you get double, if you just get your member of Congress, then you go triple for a Republican, then you go quadruple. But yeah.
This is what I deal with all the time, these two. Right here.
One question I want to make sure we get to, okay? This thing goes into effect, the in-kind order goes into effect September 26th. That's the end of this quarter, is September 30th. Checks for that quarter will come out probably around the end of October, the middle of November. But we may not see a large impact that shows up in that check, okay? However, the December ended quarter, we'll get checks at the end of January, maybe the middle of February. How should folks react when they see that check?
Well, I think the order is clear that, and you can correct me on this, the cable operator does not have the ability to unilaterally change the franchise. They do have to come in for a modification. Is that how you would?
That's not how I read it. Actually, NCTA proposed a process, which the commission didn't adopt. And I think there's an additional reason why some cable operators will withhold and make you sue them. Because if they sue you later on, they might run into an argument that that's a damages claim that's precluded by the Cable Act, which is what happened in the Sacramento case. So I think my concern is what you will find out in the January, mid-February, that you're going to have a shortfall. Now, what do you do? Which was your question. Yes. One thing you could do is sue them. Now, the question is, if you don't want a statute of limitations run, do you want to sue them the next day? Do you want to sue them in a month? Do you want to see how long you have to wait for this appeal? This appeal, someone said earlier, we're talking about 18 months minimum. You're not going to get a decision out of the Court of Appeals, I don't think, until you'd be lucky to get a decision by the end of 2020. The appeal was just filed. So the question is, do you want your suit to be going on? Now, the nice thing about your suit is because put aside, when you sue them, you're not necessarily just suing them because you disagree with the FCC order. You're also suing because for an accounting of how they came up with the deduction they made. And so you can seek discovery from them, make it very uncomfortable for them. They're going to have to hand over, they're going to have to hand over in civil discovery a lot of information about themselves.
Yeah, but let's just layer over. Let's assume we're not talking about New York City for a second, and we're talking about a city of 20, 30, 40,000, all right? So smaller subscriber base. The cost of that litigation is going to arguably be worth way more than the loss of the franchise fees. And I agree with everything you said, Tim. I'm just trying to put this on for those that are smaller jurisdictions out there. You notice a discrepancy between your third quarter and your fourth quarter payments. you certainly have the right to dig down and try to figure out, you certainly have a right of audit to figure out if they are directly offsetting. Find out what that offset is, find out what's at stake. But I'll flip the question. What if they come to you and they say, okay, I want to modify my franchise? What are you supposed to do then? Are you actually going to enter into a written modification of a franchise when you feel like there's a strong likelihood that the actual order will be overturned? You know, and I mean, I think all of us up here would say, well, there's ways around that. Yeah. You could agree to temporarily suspend some of these obligations pending the outcome of that litigation. You could do a lot of different things. And frankly, I think you can do a lot of those things and still get your renewals done. Some of you have been holding on renewals for 5 years with extended franchises, waiting for these orders to come out and clarify the world. And they're no more clear now than they were 3 months ago. But you can still get things done by putting, you know, placeholders in there pending the outcome of some of these legal challenges.
Well, and I would like to encourage folks that are in state franchising states that everybody's under the same definition of revenues and are probably going to get the same reaction from their operator when they file their tax, when they file the franchise.
Want to talk about that,
okay?
Nancy? The definition.
That they should talk to each other, talk to your state chapters, talk to your neighbors.
Go ahead.
All of you are going to be doing the same thing with the same operator under the same definition, band together, and then you're not a 20 or 30,000 city dealing with one of these companies.
Right.
Then you're a lot more.
Well, and I just, again, I would reiterate the point Garth's making about the state chapters. If you think about it, if you work on your relationship with depending on what kind of state you're in, your governor's office, your attorney general, your various elected officials at the statewide level, if you have the cable operators to put the question, do you intend to unilaterally make changes while this is still under litigation? And you have your senator there, and they're answering that question. If you know what each other are doing, and you get a letter, or you get some change, or you see that you might be able to band together and get your state attorney general to sue for a stay, or to do these things, because it impacts more than one person. And it matters from the local government if you're the poster child, but you don't have all the money. And this can be expensive litigation. It makes a lot of sense to band together with your friends and the other communities that are like you to sort of stand together and address this and get your state people, because ultimately your state people will see is that none of this is going to help them get broadband to rural places.
Let me throw out one issue that I think Garth was also alluding to about definition of franchise fees and 5%. Let me just throw out an example. 2 different cities. This city over here has a definition, I'm going to make it very dramatic, a definition of gross revenues that says you pay 5% on basic cable only. This one over here says you pay 5% on any and all revenue derived from cable, period. So hugely disparate definitions. Which one is the 5% cap on franchise fees?
Either one. No.
Well, but I mean, the question, what I want you to think about is, just because your franchise says 5% doesn't mean you are actually collecting a full 5% of gross revenues from the provision of cable. That's a very broad, all-encompassing phrase that the FCC is relying upon, and until you're at that level, everything that they're proposing to offset, if you're at the level over here, you're not at 5% of gross. You're at something far different. That actually has to be thought about before someone does a unilateral offset and says, well, I'm taking 10 grand away from you because I'm giving you free cable.
And Brian's point is good, because your cable operator probably won't do that. Unless your fee is 3% or something, so it's facially less. But as long as it says 5%, even if your revenue base is well below the maximum allowed federal definition, your operator will probably just calculate what the value of the in-kind is and just credit it. And that is not correct. I mean, one thing I don't think the FCC could disagree with is that if it's less than the maximum permitted revenue base, what the offset is measured against what the federal maximum would be, not what you what your own revenue base is if it's less than that.
And I would just, to add technically and deep into the weeds, what we would call the Pasadena franchise decision, if some of you remember, if you collect money off of advertising revenues, and there's a franchise fee that's owed on those franchising revenues, the FCC ruled that the cable operator could not charge the advertisers and instead make cable subscribers pay that cost. So what you're getting and what is 5%, there are more nuances because there might already be things that are offsetting that. So having a good accounting, doing an audit, having your audit up to date, those are all ways that you can proactively protect yourself.
And this doesn't protect yourself, but it is something to tell your cable operator friends when they come in and say, well, you know, we calculate that due to the in-kind offset that we owe you $100,000 less in cash franchise fees. You might point out to them, well, you know the Cable Act says that any reduction in franchise fee has to be passed through to the subscribers, right? So I assume that that $100,000 that you're not paying me, you're going to refund to subscribers, and I'd like some proof to that. And by the way, I might want to talk to the State Attorney General about that too.
Yep. So I hope we can have more discussion as the conference goes on about this idea of the maximum franchise fee calculation. I'll just throw this out. We're in a renewal negotiation right now with a pretty good definition of gross revenues, but of course it has its standards, but it doesn't include bad debt, it doesn't include this or that, right? And my argument was, if you want to do a set-off or an offset, we get to not use this definition of gross revenues. We get to use the maximum amount, however somebody like Garth would calculate the maximum amount of gross revenues. That's what you offset against. Mm-hmm. And the pushback was absolutely not, you're changing the definition of the term that we agreed to in the franchise. And this is an issue that I think we're going to have to dig in deep on as we go forward. But I just wanted to add my 2 cents to what all of you thankfully said, which is the offset, if there is one, is not necessarily against what your definition of franchise fees and gross revenues is. It's the maximum definition.
Well, and that's a good point that I think that I'm hoping in various, whether there's stay or other litigation that comes up, is you may have a situation with the cable operator when we agreed on what was going to be the definition of franchise fees. If I had to deduct all of these other things against the value of it, I might not have agreed to that definition. So this other idea too, that you can suddenly take away one half of it, of the negotiated benefits and get rid of those, and then we'll just stick with the other one without recognizing that they actually worked in combination. So also, for those of you who recently negotiated one and you have information about, like, you might have had those types of arguments, I would contact whoever your counsel is and provide that information, because that's going to be beneficial to somebody down the line.
Just a punchline on this discussion. The Cable Act, even though it doesn't define gross revenues, it gives you pretty good definition. Any and all revenue derived from the provision of cable services. That's, I mean, we have a 3-page definition in most of our franchises in America about how to define gross revenues. It can be one sentence, and Garth here is our CPA for a lot of different cities. He would love that definition. That doesn't exclude anything.
So would Carolyn, by the way. We've got about 2 minutes left. If nobody else has got a question, I'm just, huh?
I have one written question.
Oh, we're going to let Tim do it.
But I wasn't going to waste it. First of all, how many have ever heard of IRUs?
Indefeasible right to use.
Good. I was worried that no one would raise their hand, then they'd say, well, we're not going to waste our last 2 minutes on this question. The question is, has the FCC defined time limits on the duration of indefeasible rights of use, IRUs? Is there a definition for useful life of a cable system? The short answer to the first question is no, the FCC hasn't defined duration of IRUs. It hasn't defined much of anything about IRUs. And is there a definition for useful life of a cable system? Probably not. Now, I defer to Garth. I mean, obviously, there's a time horizon over which how cable operators depreciate their system and their assets, although you are simultaneously making additions and upgrades to that same asset, so you get sort of a very
Electronics are short time. The fiber itself, they say 40 to 60 years, you know, so it varies.
This was a dinner conversation last night at one of the breakout dinners, and
God, sounds like an exciting.
it was. I'm telling you what.
Exciting.
Other people were watching the game.
Wow.
This was us, baby. But the issue is you have a perpetual IRU. So, you know, you build fiber as a city, and then you go ahead and you give away 10 strands of it as part of an IRU. So you're essentially leasing it. Is there no limit? Can it be perpetual? Or at some point, does ownership essentially vest with the lessee? That is definitely a happy hour discussion, but
The other end of that table was discussing the generally accepted accounting practices.
Boy, I'm sorry I missed that meal.
Hey, take these.
But you know what? For anybody, if you asked that question and you didn't get an answer, I actually think Tim or Mitzi would be happy. They both are well familiar with IRUs. I gave it my shot last night, and I came up woefully short. So we have two more really smart folks here, much smarter than last night, and they could probably help answer that question.
Anybody want to finish up with anything else there?
I say one thing.
Okay.
30 years ago in 1989, I went to my first NATOA conference. I was a third-year law student, and Nick Miller, kind of the grandfather of all cable franchising, stood up and gave kind of a very depressing presentation about how it was a nice run. We laughed, we cried, but it's just about over. Cable franchising has run its course, and you all better be prepared for kind of a new horizon. And this, of course, I wasn't yet even licensed to practice law. I was just starting, and I was apparently going to go into the communications industry. So the point of my story is, here we are 30 years later, and a lot of great things have happened at the local level, in cities, in PEG organizations, a lot of consumer protection, a lot of wonderful things. All this doom and gloom that we say about these laws, cities will find a way to find the right balance and to help people and to move forward and to continue to do good work. So let's try to keep that positive attitude instead of always the doom and gloom that we do with this regulatory session. I think that's just a better way to, especially as we go to happy hour, it's a better way to end.
All right. Thanks, folks.
Oh, so everybody, I think Jeff is saying is that break out your orange passports. You can use those. I'm going by our vendors. Even if you're not playing the passport games, please do go by the vendors. Thank the vendors for coming. Introduce them if you have other of your staff here. They are one of the things that really helps the organization run. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.